a real treat. Yeah, kind of hear from Justine and to learn about her research. So join me in welcoming her.
Thank you so much for that introduction and for having me here. I'm really excited to be here and to talk with you all about some of the research that I've been doing in Cleveland over the last couple of years. My research is more or less around vacant land reuse and urban food production in Black communities in Cleveland, so I focus mostly on the east side of Cleveland. But outside of Cleveland, I've been working with and around Black farmers and gardeners for the better part of the last 9 years. Some of that has been abroad. I've lived and worked in Mali for the better part of a year, but the majority has been in sort of small to medium-sized Rust Belt cities. So Cleveland, Syracuse, 90 towns, Rochester just a little bit, and yeah, so I'm going to talk about context. So my research focuses on the intersection of race, food, and urban planning. I'm sure, as you all know, this is relevant not only to Cleveland, but really to cities across the United States. My dissertation, which is what I'm currently racing to the finish line on, is a study of how Black urban growers, both farmers and gardeners, produce urban space. So the production of space is a concept borrowed from French philosopher Henri Lefebvre. He and others sort of theorized this right to appropriate space, which is defined as the right to access space, to use it, to occupy it, to change space according to one's needs and desires. Lefebvre talks about the appropriation of space as an everyday action, but also radical. So while it might be quotidian, it also has the potential to be quite radical and to catalyze major changes across space. In Cleveland, gardeners and farmers of color across the city are reimagining both the city as a whole, so what is it to be urban, and also Black spaces in particular. I use the phrase Black agrarian imaginary to signal a vision for a different kind of urban space that pulls both from an agrarian heritage that was sort of brought up from the American South, and this heritage is shared by almost every grower that I've spoken with in Cleveland, but it also pulls from a vision of the Black experience that merges the past, the present, and an imagined liberated future. So some of the larger questions that I explore are about access to resources, relationships between growers, mostly residents, and the state, which includes planners, city council people, other officials in the state apparatus. And I believe that this is really important to understanding how power relations form or influence and are malleable within urban space, so especially within historically marginalized and under-resourced neighborhoods. So the reason I talk about this aspect of my work is that I'm really interested in Black epistemologies, or ways of knowing. So how they help to shape and form the work of Black farmers and gardeners. This talk is going to center on 2 of 3 epistemic tensions that I explore in my writing about Cleveland. These tensions exist in large part between Black growers and the various arms of the state that they encounter on a regular basis. Like I said, planners, community development professionals, council people. There's often, I find, a discursive alignment between Black residents who grow food and work the land and the state officials that represent them. However, the epistemic differences between a state approach to land and the agrarian imaginary that I'm outlining creates tensions that can't really be resolved until we have a better understanding of the different epistemological framings. So my goal is to shed light on the contestations over and struggle between different value propositions for vacant urban land, as well as the parallel tension between community-based growth and a more developed model of urban development, sort of market-driven model of urban development. A third tension outlined up here between, sort of characterized by the differences in economic relations between and within Black communities and the dominant market system also exists, and I write about it, but I won't have time to go into that today. So the epistemic tensions that frame my talk are not unique to Cleveland, as most of what I work on is not really unique to Cleveland, but they appear in different contexts, urban and rural, specifically in places of political, ecological metabolism and change. Geographer and political ecologist Alex Loftus writes, and I'm paraphrasing here, political ecologies are intertwined with hegemonic struggles, and so hegemonic projects can or should be considered socio-natural projects. I found it useful to think about the political ecological change in Cleveland through the lens of these epistemic rifts that I just outlined, and how the struggle over hegemonies continues to impact and shape the urban landscape. if you're not familiar with the political ecological framing, it's a way of thinking through ecological change in a political sense, right? So examination of power relations, examination of broader systems. It's about seeing ecological systems as power-laden rather than politically inert. So you can talk about apolitical ecologies and political ecologies, and I choose to view ecological change both in urban and rural environments, including human and non-human nature, as incredibly politically driven and power-laden. So just briefly, my data collection, I spent about 2.5 years doing formal research for my PhD between 2015 and 2018. I did almost 100 semi-structured interviews with community residents, mostly Black gardeners and farmers. I also worked with gardeners and farmers, did a lot of participant observation. My focus, like I said, is on the east side of the city. This talk will focus on the Kinsman neighborhood, which is really close to the central neighborhood, which is where Black Americans first migrated to Cleveland during the Great Black Migration of the 20th century. There is actually a really fascinating history of Black migration in the United States of which Cleveland plays a huge role. So the historical geography of this whole area of Cleveland is really rooted in an agrarian past that a lot of growers will draw upon in their everyday work. I also interviewed several city officials, community development practitioners, city planners, people from the Office of Sustainability. Talked to people at the two land banks. I think I have learned what the differences between the two land banks is. There are, many staffers from various CDCs and other real estate development agencies. So I spent a lot of time sort of digging around. Okay, so these are my research questions. I really am trying to ask to what extent Black gardeners and farmers deploy an agrarian imaginary to produce urban space in alternative ways. How are their activities operationalized by Black epistemologies, ways of knowing? In other words, what are the objectives of Black growers for alternative vacant land reuse? How do these alternative uses impact Black communities? And how does the relationship between the state and Black growers impact the initiatives that growers are trying to put forward? I have found throughout my research that race and processes of racialization underlie everything that I research. The question of race is constantly present in interviews, conversations, meetings, and experiences that I have had over these past years. That to me is central to the work that I do. A disclaimer about my maps. I know that I'm presenting maps to a bunch of people who are like real professionals in this, so please don't laugh. The epistemological tensions that I introduced are also about the racialized political landscape of Cleveland, historical geographies of Black Clevelanders, especially Black urban growers. So Kinsman, outlined in orange here, is one of the neighborhoods. It's about 96% Black, where I have done significant work. It's home to a 28-acre urban agriculture innovation zone, several community gardens, agricultural projects, and several residents, many residents who are really keen on working the land and engaging in food production. Within Kinsman, within the urban ag innovation zone, there are 2 farms that are over 6 acres. One of them is an aquaponics business, the Riddle Farm, which we'll talk a little bit more about. They host several thousand visitors each year that come to learn about their methods and philosophies of agricultural production. And then a little bit down the road, off of Grand, there's a worker-owned cooperative, the Green City Growers, with 3 acres of greenhouse hydroponic lettuce production as one of their businesses. So that's sort of a brief outline of Kinsman. Kinsman also struggles with problems that are really common to highly segregated neighborhoods of concentrated poverty. With the exception of the spatial positioning of Kinsman, which is pretty accessible to downtown Cleveland and several major highways, Kinsman is a highly neglected area of the city. The Forgotten Triangle, which is outlined here, is one of the poorest areas of Cleveland. The average per capita income in this area is just over $14,000. Cleveland isn't doing too great. I think the average per capita in Cleveland is about $18,000 or $19,000, but it's several $1,000s less. There's almost 30% unemployment, extremely low rates of educational attainment, high levels of diabetes, HIV/AIDS, maternal and infant mortality, and more than 50% of people and families receive federal food assistance. Many rely upon emergency food and visit the neighborhood soup kitchen, the Garden Valley Neighborhood House, which feeds thousands of people every week. So this part of Kinsman has some of the highest rates of vacant and abandoned and dilapidated properties in Cleveland. So, does this thing work? The pointer?
Oh, I think you have to turn it.
Oh, do I turn on? There we go. So, if you can see, the lighter blue ones are vacant land. Or sorry, the dark blue ones are vacant land, and the lighter blue ones are vacant properties. It's kind of striking when you look at this little pocket neighborhood in Cleveland, just how many vacant parcels there are. But it's not entirely an exception to the larger area in Ward 5. I speak specifically about the Forgotten Triangle just because of what is sort of found within that neighborhood. So the Western Reserve Land Conservancy did a property survey in 2015. They're currently updating it. But the 2015 property survey determined that almost 20% of the properties in this area are vacant, to say nothing of the vacant land. And more than 10% of the structures that are still standing received a D or an F rating. So there's room for improvement, to view it optimistically. In 1949, the neighborhood had high population density. It was filled with working class families. Jobs were abundant. There were, there was a large rail yard that provided a lot of employment and that acted sort of as a transportation hub through and to this neighborhood. In 1976, a fire burned down more than 60 homes in Garden Valley in this Forgotten Triangle area. It evolved into a dumping ground for toxic materials, paint cans, cars, abandoned refrigerators. Everybody who tells the story also includes dead bodies as part of the toxic material that was dumped. Bank redlining practices from the 1930s labeled this area as hazardous. So none of the houses that burned down had homeowners insurance. Supermarket redlining, which is a relatively same bank redlining practices, has left the area with no full-service grocery store. However, there are many businesses that sort of depend upon concentrated poverty for their success. So check cashing, lotto stores, alcohol, tobacco shops. This is an aerial shot of what the neighborhood has sort of evolved into. It was once really densely populated, and now you can see that it has much more rural feel. You can sort of see the outline of the Forgotten Triangle here. This is where the rail yard used to be. Yeah, so a striking, really striking difference. Okay, really a lot of text. Farmers and gardeners in this area are really keen on working the land, and while they are stewards of the land, they engage in work that really expands beyond that. So for most black growers in Cleveland, gardening or farming is more than just food production. These quotes sort of talk about moving up from the South, bringing this agrarian culture and heritage with them, having chickens and trees and gardens where they came from in Alabama. And so just all that to say that there's a lot that influences the work that people do in producing the land and producing the spaces around them. So this work of the production of space, as I call it, or as borrowing from the Fed again, is about producing and working the land, but it's also about celebrating and educating younger generations about black culture. It's about historical past, this agrarian imaginary and almost like a spiritual relationship to the land. This particular relationship to the land in Cleveland has not always been so predominant. There were many second-generation migrants whose parents maybe came up as part of the Great Migration, who kind of rejected the idea of community gardening or growing their own food in favor of a more modern lifestyle, going to grocery stores, buying food that was already prepared. However, there's a strong resurgence of black agrarianism amongst residents of all ages in Cleveland, including elders who maybe have been doing this their whole lives. And part of that, I believe, is because of the exodus of grocery stores. So there's a need for community resilience. There's a need for people to sort of I don't want to say go back to, but to sort of access this heritage in a way that can bolster the communities that they're living in. More text, you're welcome. So for the majority of growers that I interviewed, like I was saying, this idea of building community extends beyond just a parcel of land. I'll give you a moment. This text is actually really fascinating, so I'll give you a moment to read that quote. So she talks about the power of the land, the power of food, and how in terms of healing the community and healing the people that she's working with, that, you know, she doesn't even have to do anything because, you know, Mother Nature's got this. So it's like there's this way of understanding and engaging with land that goes way beyond just, you know, planting a seed and watching something grow. It has, like I said, a really deeply spiritual connection. There's also this idea that planting and nurturing the land is mirrored in the ways that we can plant and nurture an intellectual and ideological growth amongst youth. So teaching youth about the land is also planting seeds in their brains and planting seeds that will grow and giving them the space and the emotional support and the spiritual support that they need to grow and be healthy. So there's a lot of sort of parallel metaphorical ways of thinking about both growing food and growing people. The main challenge, this is probably not a surprise to anybody, comes in asserting this alternative way of living and being in the face of a hegemonic valuation of urban space that views urban space as exchange value. So views urban space as taxable income, as real estate development space, and this includes the land that growers need to access. So this is a quote from a city planner that I interviewed. She said, "We do encourage urban gardening, however we encourage it in specific areas, mainly because of the fact that we are concerned with maintaining our tax base, which is necessary for us to function." And I don't debate that. A tax base is definitely necessary for a city to function. However, this view doesn't really give space for the abstract use values cited by Black gardeners and farmers. These growers are trying to contribute to something outside of the traditional capitalist economy, and it's really only intermittently recognized by city planners and officials. Their metrics for success of land use projects typically follow the paradigm of highest and best use, which, as I mentioned, prioritizes real estate and taxable value. In Cleveland, where property values in some neighborhoods, such as Kinsman, fell as much as 80% from their peak in 2004 to only $15,000 on average in 2015. And actually, I should, you know, a little aside, the data that's coming out from the Western Reserve Land Conservancy on 2018 property value shows that there has been a little bit of growth. Properties have gained maybe $5,000 to $10,000 in value on average, which isn't nothing, but still far below their peak in 2004. So in that context, the concern over tax revenue is both legitimate and necessary, but these attempts to achieve the highest possible value for land at the expense of alternative land use practices is, as one geographer puts it, a heavy burden for movements concerned with use value. Okay, so this is sort of the development project that I am exploring as an example of the clash between these two different valuations of land. So I'm sure you're all familiar with the Opportunity Corridor, a development project. It's been in various stages of planning and construction for several years. It's scheduled to finish over the next 2 to 3 years, and much to my chagrin, I have found out that the 490 interchange at East 55th Street is going to close on May 29th for 2 years. So that'll be fun for everybody trying to get around. It's a large multi-sector transportation initiative. It's sponsored by Ohio Department of Transportation, the City of Cleveland, several community development corporations, and it will connect East 55th Interchange with University Circle, or neighborhood close to University Circle. So about 3 miles of road to basically facilitate easier commuting through the the east side of the city to the Anchor Institution. This map, which I borrowed from the ODOT page. It cuts right through Kinsman. It cuts right through the Forgotten Triangle, which is roughly outlined here in red. And Kinsman has really already seen some of the impacts of the pending construction. I think about the Opportunity Corridor as one of these hegemonic projects that Loftus talks about that's reworking the socio-natural relations that produce everyday environments. This isn't just in Kinsman that this is happening, but really across the east side of the city. Residents that I have spoken with are skeptical about the actual benefits to neighborhoods through which it will be built. They often ask, opportunity for what? Or opportunity for who? Sort of pointing out that this project doesn't really benefit Kinsman or the residents in their neighborhood, but the project really accrues benefits to more affluent, mostly white residents from other neighborhoods, commuters from outside the city. There's skepticism about demolition of houses and the relocation of businesses, a frustration over increasing difficulty of accessing land in areas prioritized for development is key to all of this. And it's also a reminder of the post-war urban renewal practices that began and were largely concentrated in Garden Valley and the Forgotten Triangle. So it's sort of harkening back to these redevelopment, revitalization, slum clearance practices that still exist in the memory of a lot of community members. So not unlike urban renewal of the 1960s, the Opportunity Corridor represents a spatial project that ultimately strives to manage and direct the movement of people and capital through the city. As with slum clearance and urban renewal, there's intense land management, there's the production of a particular kind of urban space and a particular kind of value. And there's also a sort of tacit managing of the public gaze as it moves through so-called ghetto areas, avoiding particular spaces, beautifying street fronts, sort of directing what people can and cannot see as they drive through Cleveland. These motivations, who they benefit, who they don't benefit, aren't lost to the residents of Kinsman. So how does this tie into urban ag development and land use, and how does it tie into the questions of epistemology that I was talking about at the beginning? This is the Sustainable Development Pattern Map from city planners. This is just a screenshot, so apologies for the quality of that. The Opportunity Corridor is the example of a development project within the city. Has contributed to the difficulty that many residents have in accessing land and obtaining leases for short-term or long-term land access. This map outlines prioritized development areas, neighborhoods, and communities which are set aside for their potential to accumulate value through future development. In total, it consists of 32 square miles, which is 41% of the city's land. And vacant land within or directly adjacent to prioritized areas is no longer readily accessible to residents, either to lease or to own. This is another similar version of this map. It shows a little bit less land. It's transformation initiatives highlighted by the mayor. The larger point that is made through these maps is that growers, specifically in my research black growers, who don't have the individual or collective resources to acquire significant land, are left to navigate sort of opaque contours of two land banks, the City Planning Commission, the various CUDCs who exert control over much of the city's land. One of my research participants talked about the Opportunity Corridor as representing a political land grab. Her approach, or her perspective, sort of reflects this idea that the state approach to urban development is designed to achieve important financial and spatial goals of the city, to increase tax revenue, improve urban density, and attract investment into the city. But they don't always and necessarily take into consideration what other value of land might look like, what other uses for land might be, and how that might accrue benefits to the residents of the city currently. The interesting thing about these development maps is that prioritized development areas do not always coincide with actual areas of investment or current development. Vacant land often sits fallow, if you will, for years in the hopes of or with the expectation of future development, but it's inaccessible to farmers and gardeners. So this idea of hoarding or grabbing land can be seen as an implicit privatization of the land in favor of a very singular understanding of what development and value looks like. In other words, it's this sort of epistemological privileging of a particular valuation of land. The opportunity corridor is central to the sustainable development pattern map. There's a deep radius alongside projects that are also prioritized, including Kinsman, much of the urban agriculture innovation zone. But there's no significant development planned for these areas for land within Kinsman outside of these beautification projects along the main avenue. Tens of thousands of vacant parcels fall within the whole map as a whole, like outside of Kinsman included, and it sort of prevents this idea of resident appropriation of space, so like resident access to be able to use, occupy, and change space according to their needs. I'm not sure how clear this map is. This is just another version of that same map from the Forgotten Triangle, but I've overlaid the Sustainable Development Pattern map on top of it. So here we have the Forgotten Triangle. The Riddall farm is about here. And if you can see the orange sort of hash marks across all of these parcels, these are all fall in the prioritized development area. So we have a wide radius around Kinsman, all the way up to Woodland, north of Woodland, here in Buckeye, I guess this would be sort of bordering on the Mount Pleasant neighborhood. So all of this is technically prioritized development area, while also part of this urban agriculture sustainability, or urban agriculture innovation zone. So when I say that there's tension, it's like pretty evident in this image. From the state perspective, value is taxable real estate, development, investment in land. For Black growers, there's a dominant thread around the power of space to heal community, to heal historical trauma, to celebrate multiple generations of Black agrarianism. The production of space by urban growers is a way to sort of decolonize capitalist white space, to reconnect with histories of Black resilience, to build a bridge to an emancipated Black future. Black growers view land with socially embedded value of historical and cultural significance. And from this perspective, land and space are crucial building blocks for community. These everyday practices of producing counter-hegemonic social natures has the power to really heal longstanding trauma within the Black community. The impacts of continued and persistent development of certain areas of Cleveland really foregrounds the political ecologies of land and value within the city, and it highlights one of the major struggles that Black growers face in achieving greater racial equity within the food system and in their pursuit of healthier communities. If land is valued and mapped as potential tax revenue and set aside for the future commodification as such, Black growers can really only ever have intermittent or contingent access to this resource. They are left with limited power to assert their own value proposition, which, as I've tried to outline, is one that's rooted in history, in community, and in a market structure that's deeply committed to the health and healing of the Black community, which they are a part. And I just want to finish with this quote from Ruth Gilmore, which I find a lot of meaning in. When we think about the role of race and racism and racialization of space, as she writes, it's a limiting force that pushes disproportionate costs of participating in a monetized, profit-driven world onto those who don't have the power, so they can't reach the various levers of power that might relieve them of those costs. So that's all I have for you. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you,
People have questions, comments?
First of all, I think that it's really thrilling that you're thinking about this issue in terms of alternative forms of valuation, because I think that's a real core issue. But at the same time, I wonder if you might think about some of the disadvantages of using a race the way you are. And here's some thoughts about that. in Cleveland, many of the people who, some of whom I'm sure you interviewed, who represent the state, are African American. And many of the gardeners are not African American. So I think there's a danger of falling into an oppositional logic, which A, is not quite empirically true, and B, reifies this kind of othering. Yeah. So I thought that operating at the level of the dominant forms of representation, or the dominant spatial practices, using Lefebvre in a fuller way.
Say it again.
Using Lefebvre in a more robust way might be a way to move away from that.
Yeah, and I apologize if it came off as such. I don't intend to essentialize race as any sort of oppositional structure. I think about market forces as hegemonically white in the sense of how they were constructed and who they accrue benefits to, and think less about what, counting bodies whose bodies of which ethnic or racial background are present in which space, but rather what is the history and construct of these forces and structures in terms of how, for example, valuation is structured. And I recognize that, there are many city planners who are Black American. There are many people who work in CDCs, who work in government and state apparatus who are also Black American, but they are part of a structure that has historically been dominated by a white, Eurocentric, capitalist way of thinking and structuring both space and the movement of capital. But point taken about the...
Yeah, because I think the most important thing to explore is how it is that, what are the relations of dominance and how it is that they're operating. And to focus on race as an indicator, I think, is sometimes misleading.
An indicator for...
because what happens is that, and I think that and I'm sorry, this is the last thing I'll say, but what happens is I think we get sucked into dominant forms of expressing ourselves, because although you had the very moving statements by the people, Black gardeners that you interviewed, you also introduced the demography of the Kinsman Triangle only in terms of the standard negative stereotypes. Unemployment, HIV. So that gets identified with Black. And then that gets opposed to white in kind of a dominant. Okay, now another way to talk about that neighborhood might be in terms of the number of churches, in terms of the number of community groups, in terms of, but you do that. And I don't mean you personally, but what I mean is that there's available this oppositional logic. Yeah.
I kind of feel what Han is saying almost viscerally. We did a master plan for the Kinsman Triangle, Forgotten Triangle, working with Bird Buckheart 20 years ago, maybe 20 years ago.
I think it was 2005. Early 2000s was that?
It was in the early 2000s, so maybe it was more than 15 years ago. And I remember really specifically as being, our staff being the white outsiders, advocating for agriculture in this area. And we got epic pushback. Because what people wanted to see, particularly in kind of what residents refer to as the forgotten side of the Forgotten Triangle, which is that far eastern end, they wanted to see housing there. And I don't think ethically we could have shown housing there because there was no housing demand, and the high degree of toxicity in the soil suggested that kind of residential development didn't make much sense there. And so the idea that emerged from that planning process was this tree farm. We grow trees for the city, and so city planning kind of like that. The neighborhood did neighborhood development corporation did a study you probably saw that showed that it would cost a lot of money. It would produce some trees, but it wouldn't produce many jobs. And when it came down to it, what people in the neighborhood told us and continue to tell us, because we interact with folks in this neighborhood a lot, is that employment is what matters most to them. And what we found in interacting with food producers is that it is a lot of times, particularly in that Ohio State section of the Urban Ag Innovation Zone,
Which is no longer Ohio State.
but when it was, a lot of the agricultural entrepreneurs were actually suburban folks kind of coming in to take advantage of this really nice opportunity to have clean land. The other point that actually came up a lot, and then I'll also stop, is that, you know, kind of that neighborhood is the only place in the city of Cleveland, aside from Public Square, where all three lines of the public transit rail go through. There's no other place that has that rich depth of transit. And so that also became kind of a planning question, is do you want to target agricultural uses that have already taken hold here in a very good way, but do you want to limit development to agricultural uses in a way that kind of almost undermines the opportunity to use that transit system to get people in the neighborhood to employment opportunities either in this neighborhood or elsewhere, because the transit is so seriously underutilized. So it's just so complicated. But to hear the voices, and I mean that part we never did as part of our planning work. We'd have community meetings, but the sort of one-on-one research that actually captures people's voices and kind of takes quantitative data from the things people are saying is something that's really, it's enlightening, because you can see things in the neighborhood that you can't just see from a public meeting or a kind of workshop. That wasn't a question, I'm sorry.
Did you find through your interviews with people that were gardening on the vacant land, like wanting to eventually end up owning those properties, or like create like more typical value for themselves, or were they interested in like creating more like a community park, or did you find any?
Yeah, so that sort of gets at the third epistemic tension that I address in my writing, where people want to be able to engage in the economic opportunities that are available via farmers markets. You know, I've even heard some of my research participants talk about trying to aggregate produce to sell on the West Side market, but like recognizing both that they haven't always been welcome in those spaces, and that they would like to be paid for the work that they do. So yes, there's a lot of wanting to own land, struggling to gain access to it, struggling to get anything beyond the lease. For gardeners who work with summer sprouts, they can't sell the produce that they grow. For gardeners who live in areas where vacant land is not, you know, readily accessible for longer than a year, it doesn't make sense to invest in the soil in the ways that you would need to really make money off of it. There's a lot of gardeners who are interested in forming cooperative associations, so either cooperative associations of growers, or facilitating a group of people who are really interested in starting a cooperatively owned grocery store in Central. And you know, so there's growers that would like to aggregate their produce to be able to sell in some sort of a form. The other side of that is growers who don't want anything to do with the traditional market, still want to make money, but to create something that is specifically for Black communities, within Black communities, that serves those populations exclusively, that doesn't really have any sort of connection to like the larger network of farmers markets or market gardens.
This kind of piggybacks off of that, because it's also about the way in which use value and exchange value kind of fluidly transform into each other. You know, that use value has a kind of like short half-life, especially when you start looking at it. And it relates to the idea of these agricultural target zones, you know, the way that the city has multiple planning intentions that don't actually work together.
Right.
Which I think is symptomatic of something pretty interesting, which is the degree to which these alternative forms of urban living are also marketable. So at some level, you know, I think of it this way, it's like if they're talking about it on Atlantic cities, then somebody thinks you can make money off of it. You know, that cities see urban agriculture or bike infrastructure. And, you know, that.
Contingent uses of space.
Right. So, you know, you have these, I think the quotes you have are so wonderful in talking about use value. Are these people aware of the degree to which they potentially are co-optable in that urban economy?
Yes. And I don't know about co-optable, but enveloped into the
Yeah,
urban
maybe that's a better
economy,
phrase, yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. And there is, like I was trying to explain, there is both a desire to be part of it and a desire to reject it completely.
Mhm.
So that's simple. Yeah.
I was wondering, since it seems like you based a lot of your work on Lefebvre, which Lefebvre did you use as your basis?
Which Lefebvre? He has, there's a volume that was put together, I believe, in 1996 that is called Writing on Cities, that I've used a lot. And then there's also, who is it that did the translations? Neil Brenner and Stuart Elvin put together a translation of a lot of his work, especially there's a 4-volume piece that had never been translated into English from Lefebvre called De l'État, which is a lot of his work on the differences between the different kinds of space. He talks about state space, representational space, spaces of representation. So those are 2 volumes that I've used a lot. And I mean, in the larger work that I do, I pull a lot from Lefebvre, I pull a lot from Gramsci, and sort of like the ways in which those 2 can speak to each other, so to speak, and from, you know, a few others, but yeah.
Okay, one thing I think, I don't know whether this would be useful to you or not, but I think it would. One of the things is that in the reduction of space, Lefebvre spends a lot of time talking about how the different modes of producing space are not mutually exclusive, but they coexist.
Yep.
And so the question, if you're using it as a format for analysis, the question is not either or. This, I think, feeds off a little bit what Steve's saying. The question is trying to understand the relationship between the different modes. And I think that does give a tool that helps to move away from an oppositional logic. So that it's possible, as we all know, to be more than one person at the same time. So it's also possible to have a multifaceted political, and there's also a relationship between entrenched representations of space and opportunistic policy initiatives, and you know, all of that I think there's a richness there that oppositional logic squelches. But there are the theoretical tools to tease it out.
Yeah.
And understand the dynamics in a more complex way.
I think also given the fact that we're upwards of 32,000 vacant lots in the city of Cleveland right now, that at least diagrammatically, there should be a way that it doesn't have to be either or. There's plenty of space for Cleveland to be, you know, kind of a reurbanizing place at the same time embracing this, I love this phrase, this Black agrarian imaginary. I think there's room for all of that. The only problem comes down to the decision-making moment. I mean, you probably saw all of the work around the chicken and bee ordinance and just how extraordinarily controversial it was when it was passed. Of course, now it's there, and like the bees and the chickens aren't bothering anyone.
But the urban garden district zoning that is fairly used.
Yeah.
So.
And but the potential is there. It's just like I've never in all of these years of thinking about these kinds of questions been able to understand who ultimately gets to make the decision about, you know, kind of where, I mean, I understand zoning and the way that the city makes those decisions, but, you know, kind of the ongoing negotiation of what gets to go where and how those pieces all fit together, it's a design question that doesn't seem like it should be unsolvable, and yet it feels, and not just here, but also kind of similarly in Detroit, understanding how the pieces of this mosaic actually fit together. I don't know that anybody really
I don't know, and in all of the conversations I've had with city planners, it seems like there's this specter of future development that is imminent.
Always.
Right? And that we are unable, so I come from upstate New York, which is a lot of very similar characteristics. Syracuse, Utica, Rochester, Buffalo, they share a lot of similar struggles, if you will, to Cleveland. And there, in Utica especially, there's been a lot of talk about right sizing, which has its own problems and struggles to sort of right sizing for who and for what, and what does that exactly mean. But to shift the way that we think about zoning and design and planning away from this exclusive highest and best use and potential for future urban development, I think is just a huge paradigmatic shift that is going to take time.
Much time, because I can't keep waiting. And you put the water on top of that layer? I mean, in this particular neighborhood, the sewer district is building these giant interceptor tunnels to pull the water away.
But they're also decommissioning. Right? They're decommissioning houses that should never have been built. They're buying off houses and
But
returning
you also
them.
have growers who, if you ask them, in addition to like land tenure, the other big problem they have is access to water.
Yes.
And how much they have to pay for water. And they're putting potable water that's chlorinated, which isn't super great. And so if there were, I spent so much of my life in meetings trying to think about ways of whether stormwater could be captured and then made available to food producers in the urban ag innovation zone. Damien and those guys were really, at the time, interested in seeing it happen. And it didn't. I don't know why.
Yeah.
And I'm just so sad sometimes.
I agree, yeah.
I think another way to think about, and I've done some of this in my own work, to think about decision-making is to not assume that there's going to be a decision.
Right.
Okay.
Which happens a lot with
So instead what you assume is there's kind of a regime of ongoing negotiation. So it only appears to be a decision if you freeze it.
Right. It's a war position.
And that, I think that's helpful for understanding of the nature of these things.
Yeah.
One thing though, what the issues you brought up is that every time we talk about New York City and Cleveland, you hear the same four names: Central, Kingsman, and London. Right? You look at the map when you had the map of the opportunity areas. I'll go back to the other one. They had the sweep. Okay. There's the whole southeast side. Now the thing is if you would begin to start looking at this more in class and in race, the what I call the talented tenth of the African American community is historically from Central, Kinsman, London. They're not as much in there. If everyone always runs to the normal areas, what if you shifted the focus? Because you have an amazing amount of land. I mean, that whole area.
Shifted the focus in terms of where.
Yeah, then in other words, maybe, it's like I had this discussion with a professor when I was at Cleveland State. Was Marcus Garvey right? That, okay, we're going to give the big boys downtown, University Circle, Opportunity Corridor, the Upper West Side.
Yeah.
Let us have like the southeast side. Okay, that's ours.
I talked to a lot of growers in Union Miles and like other parts of the southeast side, and one of the things that I have found within Cleveland is that there are so many people interested in doing this, so many people, but there is no food movement in Cleveland. There is no urban agriculture gardening movement. There are pockets of interest and pockets of people who are interested and doing the work, but the organization of people and people who don't want to organize, who don't want to work together. There are small groups who want to form cooperatives who, there was a person who was talking about reclaiming some of the abandoned hoop houses in Huff and sort of starting a cooperative there. There's been talk about starting cooperatives. One of my research participants in Union Miles was talking about starting a cooperative of growers. But it feels like there's a lot of disparate effort and energy being put into something that, like you said, it could be concentrated, it could be sort of marshaled together. But it hasn't taken off in that way yet. Even Riddle, half the people in Kinsman and Garden Valley don't know it exists. Have never been there. They don't know what the Green City Growers is. They see purple lights at night and they think it's some sort of like, you know, poison chemical production facility or something, you know? So, and there's a grant that I've been involved with in Garden Valley. It's a Kresge funded grant called Fresh Loam. And as part of what we did, we had this big festival and tried to bring people from both sides of Kinsman, from, you know, both sides of East 55th, places where people don't cross the street, don't intermix because they're scared of violence and scared of like gang histories and all that. So bringing everybody together, and part of what we did was this like trolley tour of the neighborhood and brought people to Green City Growers to say like, hey, this is actually what this is. And they opened their barbed wire gates and like let people come in and check it out. But yeah, so I think that I sort of got on a tangent here, but the interest is there and people have particular reasons for engaging in this work, but the collaboration and the organization and the support, frankly, has not allowed it to really take off in the way that it could.
Well, maybe we'll leave it there.
Thank you.
This was really interesting. You realize you're talking to a room of people who kind of really are very interested in this topic.
That was great.
Things we've been thinking about for a long time, so it's exciting to see your work progressing. Where are you in the PhD process? Are you?
I'm writing.
Yeah.
Yeah. This is
And then you publish it?
This is a very small slice that there's a edited volume coming out hopefully in the next couple of months through NYU Press that I wrote a chapter for that's about, and so one of the questions sort of made me think about it. It's about urban food systems and gentrification. So this idea of like urban agriculture as a precursor to other kinds of value and how urban agriculture and food production can be deployed as a way to enhance the value of the surrounding areas. Yeah. And so that volume should be really interesting. And I work on a bunch of other side projects and have published a little bit, or I'm in the process of publishing a little bit on some other projects that I've been working on. But I also just been doing this long enough. I just need to finish the dissertation and run my life.
I mean, I think that there'd be a lot of people interested in your kind of work when it's published. That
Yeah.
If there's any way we can help you disseminate that, your blog and all those sources,
Appreciate that.
just big community to our
Yeah.
areas. Okay. All right, so everyone come back next week for Jeff Knopf. He's going to be talking